Thank you very much. I think Mike slightly broke with the party line by saying how quickly and easily he'd analysed all that data, because we pre-agreed to give the impression that it took hours and hours and we're all absolutely exhausted. But actually that is critically useful data, as you'll see in the light of this overview. So this is an overview of the main results and incidents. And if you want to, as it were, track some of the data, it's in Chapter 6, and it's essentially cutouts from the same graphs and figures. So I'll leap straight into it. I got slightly longer with 20 minutes than for my previous talk, but I'll go straight to these results. I'm not going to talk about the psychological impact and what patients felt. That'll be in the first talk after the break by Jackie Andrade. 269 sort of identified centres for this part of the study, 108 of which filed 0 returns over the year, so they did not have a case to report and said so. 161, 60% of centres had a report to file. There were a total of 471 requests to upload data concerning a patient. 130 of these were judged inadmissible at the sort of NAP5 front office using a standard questionnaire, which meant that 341 logins were issued. Usually, at this stage, the inadmissibility was related to the timing of the event. It had already been reported, or it was outside the collection period. Of the 341 logins issued, 20 were unused by the local coordinators. We don't know why, perhaps because later they realised it was inadmissible, which meant that 320 logins were used in cases submitted to us. We, the panel, judged 21 of those to be inadmissible, and so we finally accepted 300 cases that we put into what Tim calls the sorting hat. And the sorting hat filtered them into these categories that Tim previously outlined, with these two being the main focus of interest: certain, probable, 110, just over a third of cases; possible, 31, 10% of cases. So 141 cases were the main focus of our interest. Sedation, where patients reported awareness after sedation, that'll be discussed later in the day, were 11% of cases. So a significant group there. Intensive care, there were a few cases, and that's a discussion later today. Unaccessible and unlikely together constituted 10%. Swaps and drug error, another lecture this afternoon, 20 cases, 7%. And this group of statements only, this is where the patient makes a statement that I think I was aware, but there are absolutely no case notes or data to know what has happened, or even if they've had an operation or an anaesthetic. So this is just a statement. But nonetheless, it's almost a quarter of these were statement only. In the report, there is a chapter devoted to analyses of those, which is interesting, but clearly can't be counted as very robust data. Just to illustrate what the sort of thing that was inadmissible or unquantifiable. For example, a patient with a complex medical history with kidney disease and electrolyte imbalance underwent an uneventful anaesthetic, which included neuromuscular blockade, appropriately monitored. But when the patient was fully awake, they complained of leg and arm weakness that lasted several hours, that led to distress and sleep disturbance for several weeks. This was much discussed, but there was no actual report of awareness at any point. There was no expectation of unconsciousness and awareness instead, and so this was judged inadmissible. There were many cases where patients moved during the surgery. One patient even sat bolt upright during surgery. Anaesthesia was deepened, and when the local practitioners questioned the patient afterwards, there was no report of awareness and no recall. Again, much discussed, but although the patient was clearly responsive in some manner during surgery, all these patients, there was no report of awareness, and in the context of an expectation of unconsciousness, so was judged inadmissible. So that was our decisions for inadmissibility. So the main focus are these certain probable and possible reports, and this is where Mike's data is absolutely crucial, because we can compare the percentages of the elements in the activity survey with the percentages in the awareness cohort to generate a sort of relative risk or a hazard ratio. So in the following graphs, the proportions are presented with the lines always being the activity survey, some of the data you've seen already in Mike's talk presented in a slightly different way, and the bars being the awareness cohort. So age distribution, that's the lines are Mike's age distribution, identical to the graph you saw earlier, and the bars are the awareness cases, and you see that awareness is most common in the young middle-aged adult group, consistent with what was suggested in the baseline survey. The bars exceed the height of the lines, so there's an overrepresentation. Awareness appears more common in the obese. The bar is much higher in the obese than it is in the activity survey, but broadly matched for other groups, perhaps a little lower if you're normal weight. ASA grade is not influential. The lines and the bars pretty much match throughout. And we might speculate that the higher ASA grades are possibly more sensitive to anaesthetic, and they get more anaesthetic, so appropriately somehow they're being normally matched, but that's speculation. The phase of anaesthesia, again, awareness is most common in the dynamic phases, just like in the baseline. This is almost an identical graph as it happens, but this is the prospective cohort. Induction and emergence together constitute almost 2/3 of cases versus maintenance, which is of itself the minority. Types of surgery. This is Mike's lines that you saw earlier for types of surgery in the activity survey, and two specialties stand out as overrepresented in the awareness cohort: obstetrics and cardiothoracics. There's a suggestion, unexplained, that perhaps trauma orthopedics and plastics are underrepresented in the awareness group, somehow being protective, but that's pure speculation and not as dramatic as the overrepresentation. We were able to look at the modes of anaesthesia, the different drugs used, monitoring, etc. And this is the full graph, the lines being the activity survey, the bars being the awareness cases. I'm going to blow this up in the next, zone in on some of the key points and blow it up for further discussion. So induction, this is the same graph sort of blown up. Overrepresentation of thiopentone in the awareness cases, etomidate, and rapid sequence induction. Those are the three main points. Mike has mentioned the issue of thiopentone. Essentially, it's not used in normal cases. It's only used in obstetrics, and it's only used in rapid sequence inductions. And it is massively overrepresented. So there's a story and a discussion to be had about thiopentone and rapid sequence induction. Etomidate may be the same story, but numerically, the N numbers we had were much lower, and therefore there may be an unfamiliarity with its use. Maintenance, the key overrepresentation here is TIVA, total intravenous anaesthesia. And I'm sort of whetting your appetites. This is not the end of the story. We're not saying it's a risk, it's a question mark. Is TIVA a risk? And a talk later this afternoon will drill down to explaining that paradox. In short, it may be misuse, misapplication of TIVA, etc., as will be discussed. But the crude overview is that it stands out as a signal from amongst the noise. Interestingly, nitrous oxide is neither a risk nor protective. It's perfectly matched. And that may be, it's a neutral effect, and that may be because when you use nitrous, people may be reducing the volatile, so the net effect is neutral. That's speculation, but it seems plausible. Curiously, sevoflurane appears quite protective against awareness, in contrast to the other volatiles which are matched. And that raises a highly speculative possibility of very agent-specific effects at the receptor level or channel level, which then leads to possible genetic influences. But it is quite strikingly different. Unexplained. This is an important slide, neuromuscular blockade. And if there's any take-home message about today, it is the overriding importance and seriousness and harm that is caused by neuromuscular blockade in our awareness cohort. And there is an unholy trinity that can be guaranteed on the basis of this data to lead to awareness. First, use of neuromuscular blockade itself, greatly overrepresented in the awareness cases. In fact, almost all our cases, over 90%, receive neuromuscular blockade. Awareness pretty much doesn't happen if you don't have neuromuscular blockade. Secondly, you couple that with not monitoring the blockade. So the use of the nerve stimulator was massively underrepresented in the awareness cohort as opposed to the general population of cases. And thirdly, to compound that unholy trinity, you don't bother to reverse the blockade. Reversal underused in the awareness cohort versus the activity survey. Put those together and you have the perfect storm to create awareness with paralysis. And in many cases we found, not analysed in this overview, you add to that an attempted deep extubation as well. So you have the full house. So this is an important message and very starkly portrayed by the signal-to-noise analysis. Depth of anaesthesia monitoring. This is simply to whet your appetites for a lecture later on. It's to be discussed later this afternoon. Essentially, the message is not really relevant to our discussion today. And the reason it's not relevant is it's not really used, as Mike said. Just under 3% of all cases. So it's way down there in the histograms. However, and this is to whet your appetite interest, its use in the AAGA, the awareness cases, exceeds the activity survey. So, superficially, it presents a risk of 50%. I'm going to leave that there. The paradox, it's to keep you after lunch. The paradox will be explained, and it is an interesting explanation. The second half of the talk is about incidences. And what we've learned is really to say incidence of what? What do we mean? I think everyone, the press particularly, are interested in the incidence, the headline figure. And what we've learned, and what is clearly even from these preliminary talks should be apparent, is that awareness is a highly heterogeneous condition, a highly heterogeneous experience. Different methods are looking at different things. So if you perform a Bryce-type study of questioning, you end up with an incidence of 1 in 600. If you do a survey of anaesthetists, you end up with an incidence of 1 in 15,000. And if you do a prospective study, you end up with another incidence of 1 in 19,000, which is the headline incidence that we're quoting, which is the aggregate sort of number. They're all different because there are subgroups. If we take all the patient reports that were made, the request for logins, the 471, you end up with an incidence estimate of 1 in 6,000. If you just take the admissible reports, it's 1 in 12,000. If you then take the certain probable or possible reports, it's the 1 in 19 to 20,000. If you take the cases where no neuromuscular blockade was used, it's 1 in 136,000. Doesn't really happen. If you, however, look at the cases where neuromuscular blockade was used, it's 1 in 8,000. Cardiothoracic is pretty much the same as neuromuscular blockade because it's used almost universally, 1 in 8,000. If you look at caesarean section, it's 1 in 670, which is close to Bryce. Pediatric, 1 in 61,000. Awareness after sedation, 1 in 15,000. Awareness after sedation is much more common than it is after general anaesthesia. So all these are represented here from exactly the same data set, a vast range of incidences, whatever that word means, from 1 in 670 to 1 in 136,000. So there's no single incidence statistic in reality. Bryce differs from NAP5. The NAP5 main study differs from its own baseline study. Within NAP5, there are differences in incidence between the categories. Different methods are looking at different things, and the different entities differ in the degree to which they're detected by the different methods. So it's layer upon layer of analyses. And all these differences do need researching. We need to understand why the Bryce is so different from our spontaneous reporting studies, and we need to understand why caesarean section incidences are so close to the Bryce. And all this we've suggested as future research. This is just a plot of from a separate publication of mine. This is a log scale of the number of cases annually going down, and so even small changes in the bar height are massively important. This is the number of the 3 million general anaesthetic cases. This is the number receiving neuromuscular blockade. This is the bar height, which are the positive response to an isolated forearm, which is about a third of this bar height. These are the Bryce positives, the 1 in 600 incidence. This is the spontaneous reports, and this is the proportion that are in distress or pain, complaint, legal action. So you can almost say that the acceptably aware are those who are positively responding to an isolated forearm, but not reporting any distress, neutral reactions. But it's the unacceptably aware group, it's a separate group that have pain, distress, etc. So underlining the heterogeneity of the condition that we're talking about. So in conclusion, the risks as an overview, another talk's going to drill down into the specific risks statistically, appear to include middle-aged adults, young middle-aged adults, obesity, thiopentone as an induction agent, possibly also etomidate, rapid sequence induction, therefore obstetric anaesthesia, and cardiothoracic, especially because of neuromuscular blockade. A neuromuscular blockade especially so when no nerve stimulator is used and there is no reversal used. TIVA TCI as a possible risk to be discussed, and depth of anaesthesia monitoring to be discussed. Conclusions of the incidence, while Bryce is 1 in 600, we're reporting 1 in 19,000. However, we're also reporting what none of the Bryce studies have done, a vast difference in the so-called incidence from 135, 136,000 when no blockade is used to 1 in 8,000 when neuromuscular blockade is used, to right as high as 1 in 670 for caesarean section. No single incidence, as is highly context specific. And it's because of this context specificity that the day and our report has been structured into the various subspecialties and specific themes that you see constitute the chapters of this report. Thank you.